The asphalt was still warm beneath my feet, even though the sun had started its descent behind the interstate overpass. I stood there clutching my purse against my chest, watching the taillights of my son's BMW disappear into the stream of evening traffic. The mechanical hum of the highway filled the silence where his voice should have been, where his explanation should have been, where his apology definitely should have been. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Judith Carter, 62 years old, standing alone at mile. Marker 187 on Interstate 40, abandoned like a piece of unwanted luggage. The rest stop around me buzzed with the ordinary chaos of travelers. Families stretched their legs, truckers grabbed coffee, teenagers complained about long drives. Everyone had somewhere to go, someone waiting for them. Everyone except me. My phone buzzed in my trembling hands. A text from Marcus, my 34-year-old son who had just driven away without a backward glance. Mom, I think it's time you learn to be more independent. Someone will give you a ride. M. Someone will give you a ride. As if I were a hitchhiker. He'd picked up out of pity, not the woman who had raised him alone after his father died in Afghanistan when Marcus was barely 8 years old. The worst part wasn't the abandonment. The worst part was that I wasn't even surprised. The drive to the rest stop had started 3 hours earlier, with what I thought was going to be a pleasant mother-son road trip. Marcus had called me the week before, his voice unusually warm over the phone. Hey Mom, I'm driving to Charlotte for a business conference. Want to come along? We could spend some time together. Maybe stop at that antique mall you're always talking about. I had been so happy I nearly cried. It had been months since Marcus had suggested we do anything together. Months since he'd shown any interest in my company at all. His girlfriend Vanessa had been increasingly territorial about his time, and their new condo in the upscale part of town felt like a fortress I needed special permission to enter. I packed carefully for the trip, choosing my best traveling clothes, the navy blue slacks and cream blouse that Marcus had once complimented. I brought along homemade snickerdoodles in a vintage tin, the kind he used to devour as a teenager, and downloaded podcasts about entrepreneurship thinking we might listen together and discuss his growing marketing firm. When Marcus picked me up that morning, I noticed immediately that something was different. His usual perfunctory hug felt even more distant, and he seemed agitated, checking his phone constantly even before we pulled out of my driveway. Vanessa sat in the passenger seat, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, scrolling through her phone with manicured nails that clicked against the screen. Hi, Mrs. Carter, she said without looking up, her voice carrying that particular tone that managed to sound polite and dismissive at the same time. I had asked her multiple times over the past 2 years to call me Judy, but she persisted with the formal distance that kept me feeling like an outsider in my own son's life. The first hour of the drive passed in uncomfortable quiet. I tried to engage them in conversation from the back seat, asking about Marcus's business, about their recent vacation to Napa Valley that I'd seen photos of on social media. Marcus answered in clipped sentences, while Vanessa occasionally made little humming sounds of agreement without contributing anything substantial. When I offered the tin of cookies, reaching between the seats with a hopeful smile, Vanessa wrinkled her nose. Oh, we don't really do sugar anymore, Mrs. Carter. We're on a pretty strict clean eating regimen. She said it like I had offered them cigarettes instead of the cookies that had once been Marcus's favorite treats. Marcus glanced at the tin in the rearview mirror and shrugged. Thanks anyway, Mom. The dismissal in his voice stung more than Vanessa's outright rejection. These were the same cookies he used to sneak from the cooling racks when he thought I wasn't looking. The same recipe I'd taught him to make himself when he was 12 and wanted to impress a girl in his class. The tension in the car grew thicker as the miles passed. Vanessa and Marcus spoke in a kind of code, referencing people and places and inside jokes that excluded me completely. When I tried to join their conversation about a restaurant they were Considering for dinner, Vanessa turned in her seat and said with a tight smile, "It's probably not really your kind of place, Mrs. Carter. Very modern fusion cuisine." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Too sophisticated for you, too expensive for you, too young for you. I swallowed the hurt and turned to look out the window at the farmland rushing past, feeling suddenly ancient and out of place in my own son's car. About 2 hours into the drive, Marcus's phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system. The caller ID showed Rick Morrison, boss, and I felt a little thrill of curiosity. I had heard Marcus mention Rick before, the founder of the marketing agency where Marcus worked as a senior account manager. It was a prestigious position at a growing company, something Marcus was clearly proud of, though he rarely shared details with me anymore. "Marcus, my man." Rick's voice filled the car, jovial and confident. "Quick question about the Henderson account. Did you get those revised numbers to them yet?" I watched Marcus's jaw tighten in the rearview mirror. "I'm actually on the road right now, Rick. Family trip, but I'll handle it first thing Monday." "Morning? Family trip?" Rick's voice took on a teasing tone. "The Marcus I know doesn't take family trips. What's the occasion? Hot date with Vanessa somewhere romantic?" Vanessa giggled, a sound that made my teeth clench. "Not exactly romantic with his mother in the back seat," she said loud enough for the phone to pick up. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing down on the car. Rick's laugh was uncertain, clearly not sure how to respond to what Vanessa had just revealed. "Oh, well, that's nice. Family time is important." Marcus's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Yeah, well, we're dropping her off somewhere along the way. She's visiting a friend." The lie came so easily, so smoothly, that it took me a moment to process what he had said. Dropping me off, somewhere along the way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wasn't going to Charlotte with them. I wasn't part of their plans at all. "Smart thinking," Rick said, his voice warming again. "Can't have mommy cramping your style at the conference after parties. Those networking events can get pretty wild." Vanessa laughed again, and this time Marcus joined in. They were laughing about me, about the inconvenience of my presence, about how much better their trip would be without me weighing them down. I sat frozen in the back seat, feeling like I had been slapped. The conversation moved on to business matters, but I couldn't focus on the words anymore. All I could hear was the sound of their laughter echoing in my ears, the casual cruelty of it, the way they had discussed discarding me like an unwanted piece of baggage. When the call ended, the car fell into an even more uncomfortable silence. I wanted to confront Marcus, to demand an explanation, to ask when exactly he had decided to deceive me about the purpose of this trip. But something in his posture, in the set of his shoulders and the way he avoided my eyes in the mirror, warned me that any confrontation would only make things worse. Instead, I sat quietly and tried to make sense of what was happening. Had this entire trip been a setup from the beginning? Had Marcus never intended to include me in his Charlotte plans? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more painful than the last. About an hour later, Marcus pulled into the rest stop where I now stood alone. He had been unusually quiet since the phone call, and Vanessa had fallen asleep against the passenger window, her head tilted at an angle that somehow managed to look elegant even in sleep. "I need to stretch my legs," Marcus announced, pulling into a parking space near the main building. "Mom, why don't you use the restroom? Get some coffee or something. We'll be here for a few minutes." I climbed out of the car gratefully, my body stiff from the hours of sitting in tense silence. The rest stop was busy with early evening travelers, and I made my way to the restroom, then stopped at the vending area to buy a bottle of water. When I returned to where we had parked, the space was empty. For a moment, I thought I had simply forgotten where Marcus had parked. I wandered between the rows of cars, looking for the familiar silver BMW, telling myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe he had moved the car to get gas. Maybe they were in the convenience store and I had somehow missed them. But as the minutes ticked by and the parking lot remained BMW-free, the horrible truth began to settle in my chest like a cold stone. They had left me. My son and his girlfriend had actually driven away and left me stranded at a highway rest stop, like I was nothing more than an inconvenience they had finally worked up the courage to abandon. That's when my phone buzzed with Marcus's text message. The one that made it crystal clear this wasn't a mistake or a miscommunication. This was intentional. This was planned. This was my son telling me that I was no longer welcome in his life, not even as a passenger in his car. I read the message 3 times before the words really sank in. Someone will give you a ride. As if I were a stranger he had offered a ride to out of politeness, not his mother who had sacrificed everything to give him the best life possible after his father's death. Standing there in the growing dusk, surrounded by the sounds of traffic and strangers, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break exactly, but crack like ice beginning to give way under pressure. For the first time in my life, I truly understood what it meant to feel invisible, discarded, forgotten by the person who was supposed to love me most in this world. The memories came flooding back then, unbidden and unwelcome, of all the ways Marcus had been pulling away from me over the past few years. The shorter phone calls that became even shorter text messages. The holidays he spent with Vanessa's family instead of with me. The birthday dinner where he checked his phone more than he looked at me. The Mother's Day when he sent flowers through. A delivery service instead of visiting, with a card that was obviously pre-written by the florist. I had made excuses for all of it. He's busy building his career. He's in love and wants to spend time with his girlfriend. He's becoming independent, which is what I raised him to be. I had convinced myself that the distance was natural, temporary, a phase that would pass when he matured a little more. But standing there at mile marker 187, holding his cruel text message in my shaking hands, I realized that the distance hadn't been natural at all. It had been intentional, calculated, a slow and steady process of erasing me from his life, and I had been so eager to maintain our relationship, so desperate to keep him close, that I had participated in my own erasure by making excuses for behavior that was inexcusable. The woman who had worked 3 jobs to pay for his college tuition, while he lived in the dorms, complaining about the cafeteria food I couldn't afford to eat myself. The woman who had driven 8 hours round trip every few weeks just to take him to dinner and make sure he was okay. The woman who had co-signed his car loan when his credit wasn't good enough, who had given him the down payment for his condo as an early inheritance, who had never missed a birthday or a graduation or any milestone that mattered to him. That woman was now standing alone at a rest stop, abandoned like roadside litter. But as I stood there watching the traffic rush past, something else began to stir beneath the hurt and the shock. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something colder and more dangerous. It was clarity. Marcus had miscalculated. In his eagerness to rid himself of the inconvenience of his mother, he had forgotten something crucial. He had forgotten that the woman he had just discarded wasn't just a lonely old lady with hurt feelings. She was Judith Carter, the woman who had built a successful interior design business from nothing, who had connections throughout the city, who had friends and clients and a reputation that had taken decades to establish. And one of those friends, I suddenly remembered, was Patricia Chen, the senior partner at Chen & Associates, the law firm that handled corporate contracts for some of the biggest businesses in the state, including, if I remembered correctly from our last conversation over coffee, Marcus's precious marketing agency. I pulled out my phone again, scrolling through my contacts until I found Patricia's number. We had been friends since our children, were in elementary school together, had maintained our friendship even after her daughter moved to California, and my relationship with Marcus began to deteriorate. Patricia was sharp, successful, and absolutely ruthless when it came to business ethics. She was also someone who understood the value of loyalty, having built her own career while raising her daughter alone after her husband left them for his secretary. My finger hovered over her number for a long moment. Was I really considering this? Was I actually contemplating using my connections to interfere with Marcus's career? The mother in me recoiled from the idea. But the woman who had just been abandoned at a highway rest stop, the woman who had spent years being slowly erased from her son's life, that woman had no such hesitation. Marcus had made his choice when he drove away from this rest stop. Now it was time for him to learn that choices have consequences, even when you think no one important enough to matter is watching. I dialed Patricia's number. "Judy?" Her voice was warm and surprised. "What a lovely surprise. How are you, honey?" "I'm fine, Patricia," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I hope I'm not calling it a bad time, but I have a question about business ethics, and I thought you might have some insight." "Of course. What's going on?" I took a deep breath, watching an 18-wheeler pull into the parking space where Marcus's car had been just an hour earlier. If an employee at a company was caught abandoning a family member at a highway rest stop, would that reflect poorly on the company's reputation? Would it be the kind of thing that might concern a client who values family values and corporate responsibility? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Patricia was too sharp not to realize this wasn't a hypothetical question. "Judy? What happened? Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I repeated, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. "I'm just curious about how these things work in the corporate world. If someone were to document this kind of behavior and share it with the right people, would it matter?" "It absolutely would matter," Patricia said firmly. "Companies spend millions on their public image, especially in the service industry. An employee who abandons family members would be seen as a liability, someone whose poor judgment could reflect badly on the entire organization. Most contracts include morality clauses these days." I closed my eyes, feeling something settle into place inside my chest. "And if this employee worked for a company that your firm had contracts with?" Another pause, longer this time. "Judy, do you want to tell me what's really going on? Because it sounds like you're not asking hypothetical questions anymore." I looked around the rest stop one more time, at the families loading back into their cars, at the travelers who all had someone waiting for them somewhere down the road. Then I told Patricia exactly what had happened, from Marcus's fake invitation to his text message that still glowed on my phone screen. When I finished, the silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call might have dropped. "Patricia? Are you there?" "I'm here," she said, and her voice had changed completely. The warmth was still there, but now it was backed by something harder, more dangerous. "And I'm furious. Judy, you know I adore you. And what Marcus did is absolutely unacceptable. No decent human being abandons their mother at a rest stop like she's garbage." "I just don't know what to do," I admitted, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt tears threatening. "I don't even know how to get home from here." "First things first," Patricia said briskly. "Where exactly are you? I'm sending a car service to pick you up right now. You're not spending another minute stranded because of that ungrateful boy." I gave her the mile marker and the name of the rest stop, feeling a rush of gratitude so strong it almost knocked me over. This was what real friendship looked like, what genuine care felt like. The contrast with Marcus's casual cruelty was so stark, it made my chest ache. "The car will be there in 45 minutes, Patricia continued. "And Judy, I think it's time Marcus learned that actions have consequences. You mentioned he works for Morrison Marketing Group, right?" My breath caught. "You know them?" "Oh, honey, I know them very well. Rick Morrison and I go way back, and my firm handles several of their major contracts. Rick considers himself a family man, talks constantly about values and loyalty and treating people right. He would be absolutely appalled to know that 1. of his senior employees abandons elderly family members at highway rest stops. Patricia, I don't want to ruin Marcus's career, I said quickly, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure it was true anymore. You're not ruining anything, she replied firmly. Marcus made his choices. All we're doing is making sure the right people know what kind of character he really has. Rick Morrison deserves to know if one of his employees is capable of this kind of cruelty, especially since Morrison Marketing Group built their reputation on being a family-oriented company. I stood there in the growing darkness, holding the phone against my ear, feeling something shift inside me like tectonic plates rearranging themselves. For years, I had protected Marcus, made excuses for him, smoothed over his rough edges with anyone who might judge him harshly. I had been his shield against consequences, his safety net when his choices caught up with him. But Marcus had just cut that safety net himself when he drove away from this rest stop. He had decided that I was expendable, that my feelings didn't matter, that my well-being was someone else's problem to solve. What would you do, Patricia? I asked quietly. I would make sure that young man understood that his mother isn't someone who can be discarded without consequences, she said without hesitation. And I would make sure he never had the opportunity to treat another human being this way again. I watched the headlights of passing cars create ribbons of light in the darkness, each one carrying people toward home, toward family, toward people who valued their presence. In the distance, I could see the lights of the car service Patricia had sent, already making its way toward me across the parking lot. Make the call, I said finally, my voice clear and steady. Marcus needs to learn that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. And for the first time since I had read his text message, I smiled. The car service Patricia sent was a sleek black sedan with a driver named Miguel, who treated me with the kind of respectful kindness I had almost forgotten existed. He helped me into the back seat, asked if I needed water or if the temperature was comfortable, and didn't pry about why a woman my age was being picked up alone at a highway rest stop after dark. Sometimes the mercy of strangers cuts deeper than the cruelty of family. During the 2-hour drive home, I found myself thinking about Marcus as a little boy, back when I was the center of his universe instead of an embarrassment he needed to hide. After David died in that roadside bomb outside Kabul, Marcus had clung to me with a desperation that broke my heart. He was 8 years old and suddenly terrified that everyone he loved would disappear without warning. For months after the funeral, he wouldn't let me out of his sight. He followed me from room to room in our little house, sat on the bathroom floor while I showered, slept in my bed because nightmares about explosions kept him awake. When I had to go to work at the furniture store, he would cry and beg me not to leave, convinced that I wouldn't come back. I remember the morning when I finally had enough money saved to quit that job and start my own interior design business. Marcus was 10 then, old enough to understand that things were going to get better, but still young enough to believe his mother could fix anything. He helped me set up my first office in our spare bedroom, organizing fabric samples and paint, chips with the solemnity of a much older child. "Mom," he had said, looking up at me with David's dark eyes, "when you're rich and famous, will you still live with me?" I had laughed and ruffled his hair, promising him that no matter how successful I became, he would always be my most important client. It was a promise I kept even when keeping it cost me relationships with men who couldn't understand why my son came first, even when it meant turning down opportunities that would have required travel or late nights away from home. Marcus thrived under that attention. He grew confident and funny, popular at school, but never too cool to spend Saturday mornings helping me with design consultations. Clients loved him, this charming boy who could discuss color palettes and furniture placement with surprising sophistication. He was my sidekick, my helper, my proudest accomplishment. When did that change? When did the boy who used to brag to his friends about his famous designer mom become the man who was embarrassed to admit I existed? I thought about high school graduation, when Marcus had been valedictorian and gave a speech that mentioned how grateful he was for his mother's sacrifices. I had cried in the audience, so proud I thought my heart might burst. College graduation 4 years later, when he hugged me tight and whispered that he couldn't have done it without me. Even his first job interview, when he called me nervous and asked me to talk him through his outfit choices because he trusted my eye for putting together the right image. Somewhere between that phone call and tonight, I had become someone he was ashamed to be seen with, someone whose presence cramped his style, whose feelings didn't merit consideration, whose well-being was an inconvenience he could simply drive away from. Miguel caught my eye in the rearview mirror as we approached my neighborhood. "Everything all right back there, ma'am? You need tissues or anything?" I realized I had been crying without noticing, tears sliding down my cheeks as silently as the memories had been sliding through my mind. "I'm fine," I said, accepting the packet of tissues he handed back. "Just thinking about old times." "Sometimes old times are the only times worth thinking about," he said gently, and I found myself wondering about his story, about who he had lost or left behind to be driving strangers around at night with such practiced kindness. When we pulled into my driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered, more vulnerable in the darkness. I had lived here for 15 years, ever since the interior design business took off well enough for me to afford something bigger than our starter home. Marcus had picked out his own bedroom, painted it himself in colors he swore he would never outgrow. Blue and silver, sophisticated colors for a teenager who was eager to leave childhood behind, but not quite ready to admit it. That room was exactly the same now as it had been when he left for college. I had kept it like a shrine, changing the sheets regularly and dusting the bookshelves filled with his high school trophies and college textbooks he never came back for. Whenever he visited, which had become increasingly rare, he stayed in the guest room instead, claiming his old room felt too small, too childish. Now I wondered if the real reason was that his old room contained too many reminders of who he used to be, back when he loved me without reservation and wasn't ashamed to show it. Miguel waited until I was safely inside before driving away. Another small kindness that reminded me that decent people still existed in the world. I stood in my entryway for a long moment, looking around at the home I had built with such careful attention to detail. Every piece of furniture told a story. Every color choice reflected years of experience helping other people create spaces that felt like sanctuary. This should have felt like sanctuary too, but tonight it felt like a museum dedicated to a relationship that no longer existed. The photos on the mantelpiece chronicled Marcus's evolution from gap-toothed little boy to serious college graduate to polished young professional. In every single picture, he was smiling, looked genuinely happy to be. Wherever he was, whoever he was with. When was the last time he had smiled like that with me? I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table where Marcus used to do his homework while I cooked dinner, where we used to plan his science fair projects and discuss his dreams for the future. He had wanted to be an architect then, inspired by watching me transform other people's houses into homes. We had spent hours sketching impossible buildings and discussing the psychology of spaces, how the right design could make people feel safe or energized or peaceful. When had he decided that marketing was more lucrative than architecture? When had making money become more important than making something beautiful and lasting? I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when my creative, passionate son had transformed into someone who measured success only in salary figures and networking opportunities. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Car got you home safely? Call me tomorrow. We need to talk about next steps." Next steps. The phrase hung in my mind like a question mark. What exactly were the next steps when your only child abandoned you at a highway rest stop? What was the protocol for this level of betrayal? I had never been one to plot revenge or hold grudges. My nature was to forgive, to make excuses, to find ways to rebuild burned bridges. Even when David's parents blamed me for their son's decision to join the military, even when Marcus's high school girlfriend's mother spread rumors about my divorce settlement. I had chosen grace over retaliation. But sitting in my kitchen at nearly midnight, still wearing the clothes I had chosen so carefully for what I thought would be a pleasant mother-son trip, I felt something different stirring in my chest. Not revenge exactly, but a cold determination that surprised me with its clarity. Marcus had calculated that I was powerless, that I would simply accept this treatment and find my own way home without causing him any inconvenience. He had counted on my maternal instinct to protect him from consequences, my history of smoothing over his mistakes and cleaning up his messes. He had miscalculated. I thought about all the times over the years when I could have let Marcus face the natural consequences of his choices, but chose instead to shield him. The time in high school when he crashed his car texting while driving and I took out a loan to replace it, instead of making him work to pay for it himself. The time in college when he failed 2 classes because he was too busy partying and I hired expensive tutors to help him catch up, instead of letting him explain to his academic advisor why his grades had slipped. The time just last year when he made a costly mistake at work, double booking a major client presentation and showing up unprepared, and called me in tears asking me to loan him money to take the client to an expensive dinner to smooth things over. I had transferred the money within an hour. No questions asked, no lecture about professional responsibility. Every time I told myself I was helping him learn from his mistakes. Every time, what I was really doing was teaching him that mistakes didn't have consequences as long as Mom was around to fix them. Well, Mom wasn't around to fix this one. Mom was sitting alone at her kitchen table at midnight, calculating exactly how much influence she had in the business community Marcus had dismissed as beneath his notice. I pulled out my laptop and opened a new document, then started typing. Not a letter, not a plan for confrontation, but a simple timeline of everything I could remember about Marcus's career trajectory, where he had worked, who had hired him, what connections had helped him advance. It was a surprisingly long list, and as I worked through it, I realized how many of those connections traced back to me. The internship he had gotten at a prestigious architectural firm during college, secured through my client who was married to one of the partners. The recommendation letter for graduate school from a professor whose house I had redesigned. The introduction to his first job interview, arranged through a contact I had made while working on a commercial project. Even his current position at A. Morrison Marketing Group had come through a network that connected back to my professional relationships. Rick Morrison's wife was a real estate agent I had worked with on several high-end home stagings. She had mentioned at a gallery opening that her husband was looking for talented young marketers, and I had suggested she meet Marcus. Marcus had never acknowledged these connections, never thanked me for the doors I had opened or the bridges I had built for him. In his version of his success story, he was a self-made man who had achieved everything through his own talent and hard work. I was just a background character, a supportive mother who had provided encouragement from the sidelines. He had forgotten that the sidelines were where I had chosen to stand, not where I had been relegated by lack of power or influence. My phone rang, startling me from my research. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it anyway. Mrs. Carter, this is Detective James Rodriguez with the State Highway Patrol. I'm calling about an incident report filed earlier this evening. My blood ran cold. An incident report? I'm sorry, I don't understand. What kind of incident? We had a report of an elderly woman being abandoned at mile marker 187 on Interstate 40. A trucker called it in, said he saw a car drop someone off and drive away, thought it looked suspicious. When we arrived to check it out, you were gone, but we found some witnesses who gave us a partial license plate. The vehicle registration traces back to a Marcus Carter at this address. I closed, my eyes feeling a mix of humiliation and vindication. Strangers had witnessed my abandonment, had been concerned enough to call the police. While my own son drove away without a second thought, complete strangers had worried about my safety. Ma'am? Are you all right? Do you need us to file charges? For abandonment or endangerment? The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. I could file charges. I could make this a legal matter, something that would appear on background checks and public records, something that would follow Marcus for the rest of his career, explaining to future employers exactly what kind of person they were considering hiring. Mrs. Carter, are you there? I'm here, I said slowly. Can I think about this and call you back tomorrow? Of course. Here's my direct number. And ma'am? I hope you know that what happened to you tonight isn't acceptable. Family doesn't abandon family. Not like that. After I hung up, I sat staring at the detective's number written on the notepad beside my laptop. 2 hours ago, I had been a woman whose son was ashamed of her. Now, I was a woman whose son was potentially facing criminal charges for elder abandonment. The power shift was dizzying. I thought about Marcus and Vanessa, probably checking into their hotel in Charlotte right now, congratulating themselves on how smoothly they had handled the inconvenience of my presence. They had probably already put the whole incident out of their minds, focused on their conference and their networking opportunities and their clean-eating dinner plans. Marcus had no idea that witnesses had recorded his license plate, that police were investigating, that his name was now associated with a case file. He had no idea that his boss's wife knew his mother personally, or that his mother's friend handled major contracts for his company. He had made his choices based on incomplete information, secure in his assumption that I was powerless to affect his life in any meaningful way. Tomorrow, he would start learning how wrong he had been. I closed the laptop and headed upstairs, to bed, leaving the detective's number on the kitchen table where I would see it first thing in the morning. Tonight, I needed to sleep. Tomorrow, I needed to decide exactly how much my son's betrayal was going to cost him. As I passed Marcus's old bedroom, I paused in the doorway, looking at the space I had preserved like a museum to his childhood. The blue and silver walls, the bookshelf full of trophies, the desk where he used to bring me his report cards with such pride. This was where I had raised a boy who understood loyalty, who valued family, who would never have dreamed of abandoning someone he loved. Somewhere along the way, that boy had been replaced by a man I didn't recognize, a man who could drive away from his mother without a backward glance. But tomorrow, that man was going to discover that the mother he had discarded wasn't quite as powerless as he had assumed. And maybe, if I was very lucky, he would also discover that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt no matter how much money or influence or clean-eating discipline you brought to the reconstruction project. I turned off the light in Marcus's room and closed the door behind me. Some museums, I realized, were better left closed. The morning came earlier than I expected, sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows with an intensity that suggested I had slept later than usual. When I checked my phone, it was nearly 10 o'clock, which meant I had managed almost 8 hours of sleep despite everything that had happened. My body had apparently decided that exhaustion trumped emotional turmoil. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with Detective Rodriguez's number and my laptop, ready to make the phone calls that would change everything. But first, I needed to understand exactly what my options were and what the consequences might be for each choice I made. The abandonment charges were serious, I discovered as I researched online. Elder abandonment was a felony in our state, carrying potential jail time and mandatory restitution. It would appear on background checks, affect professional licensing, possibly disqualify Marcus from certain types of employment. The legal consequences alone could derail his career permanently. But that felt too easy, too disconnected from the real lesson I wanted him to learn. Legal consequences were something that happened to you, something external that you endured and moved past. I wanted Marcus to understand that his choices had directly caused him to lose something he valued, something he had worked for, something he couldn't simply wait out or pay his way past. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to be discarded by someone whose opinion mattered to him. At 11 o'clock, I called Patricia. Judy, honey, how are you feeling this morning? I've been worried about you all night. I'm surprisingly okay, I said, and realized it was true. The shock and hurt were still there, but underneath them was something steadier, more determined. Patricia, I need to ask you about Rick Morrison specifically. What kind of man is he? What matters to him? Rick's a good man, actually, which is going to make this situation even more problematic for Marcus. Rick built his company on family values, treats his employees like extended family, sponsors little league teams, and scholarship funds. His own parents live with him and his wife, have for years since his father's stroke. He's exactly the kind of person who would be genuinely appalled by what Marcus did. And professionally? How would something like this affect an employee's standing? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Judy, are you sure you want to go down this road? Once we make this call, there's no taking it back. Rick will have to act on this information, especially if it becomes public knowledge. It's already public knowledge, I said, then told her about the police report, the witnesses, the potential criminal charges. Patricia, my son made a calculated decision that I was expendable. He's about to learn that calculation was wrong. All right then, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to call Rick this morning and request an urgent meeting about a personnel matter affecting one of our shared clients. I won't go into details over the phone, but I'll make it clear this is serious enough to require immediate attention. Can you meet me at his office at 2 o'clock? I'll be there. And Judy, bring documentation. The police report number, photos of where you were abandoned, anything that establishes a clear timeline. Rick is going to want facts, not just accusations. After we hung up, I spent the next hour documenting everything I could remember about the previous day. I drove back to the rest stop and took photos of the location, the mile marker, the parking area where Marcus had left me. I called Detective Rodriguez and requested a copy of the incident report, which he agreed to email within the hour. Then I did something that surprised me with its coldness. I called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, his voice cheerful and energetic. Hey, Mom, how was your visit with your friend? Did you get home okay? The casual lie, the easy assumption that I would participate in his fiction, the complete absence of concern for how I had managed to travel 2 hours across the state with no transportation. Every word he spoke added fuel to the fire burning in my chest. Marcus, I said calmly, I need you to tell me exactly why you abandoned me at that rest stop yesterday. Silence. Then, Mom, I don't know what you mean. You said you were visiting a friend, remember? I dropped you off where you asked me to. I never asked you to drop me off anywhere. There was no friend to visit. You lied to me about this trip, and then you abandoned me at a highway rest stop with no way to get home. Look, Mom, I think you're confused. Maybe you should see a doctor about your memory, because that's not what happened at all. The gaslighting was so blatant, so insulting to my intelligence, that I actually laughed. Marcus, there are witnesses. There's a police report. There's documentation of exactly what you did and when you did it. Another silence, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely, gone cold and defensive. What are you talking about? What police report? The one filed when concerned citizens called to report seeing an elderly woman abandoned at a rest stop. The one that includes your license plate number and identifies you as the person who left me there. Mom, you're being ridiculous. Even if someone did call the police, which I doubt, there's nothing illegal about giving someone a ride to where they asked to go. Actually, Marcus, elder abandonment is a felony, but we'll let the district attorney worry about the legal aspects. I'm more interested in the professional consequences. Professional consequences? What are you talking about? I'm talking about your boss finding out exactly what kind of person he's been employing. I'm talking about Rick Morrison learning that his senior account manager abandons family members at highway rest stops. I'm talking about your colleagues discovering that the man they trust with client relationships thinks it's acceptable to drive away from his 62-year-old mother and leave her stranded in the dark. The silence that followed was so complete I thought he might have hung up. Finally, his voice came through the phone, tight with something that might have been panic. "Mom, you can't be serious. You wouldn't really call my work about this. I have a meeting with Rick Morrison at 2 o'clock this afternoon. We'll be discussing your character, your judgment, and your fitness to represent a company that prides itself on family values." "You're bluffing. You don't even know Rick Morrison." "I know Rick's wife better than you know me, apparently. Sarah Morrison and I have worked together on dozens of real estate projects over the years. She's the one who arranged your interview. In the first place, though, I notice you never bothered to thank me for that connection." Another long silence. I could almost hear the wheels turning in his head, calculating, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage. "Mom, look, maybe we can work this out. Maybe I made a mistake yesterday. I was stressed about the conference, and Vanessa was upset about something, and I wasn't thinking clearly. The mistake you made, Marcus, was assuming that I would accept this treatment without consequences. The mistake you made was forgetting that I'm not just your mother. I'm also a businesswoman with connections and influence and a reputation that matters to people in this community. What do you want? Money? An apology? What will it take to make this go away?" The question hung between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or burn. Marcus was offering me an exit ramp, a way to handle this privately and preserve our relationship. All I had to do was name my price and accept his assumption that everything could be fixed with the right combination of words and gestures. But I thought about his casual cruelty in the car, the laughter he and Vanessa had shared about getting rid of me, the complete absence of concern for my safety or well-being. I thought about years of feeling like an inconvenience in my own son's life, years of making excuses for behavior that had grown progressively worse. What I want, Marcus, is for you to understand that actions have consequences. What I want is for you to learn that you can't treat people like disposable objects just because you think they don't have the power to fight back. So you're really going to try to get me fired? You're really going to destroy my career over this?" "I'm not destroying anything, Marcus. You destroyed your own career when you made the choice to abandon your mother at a highway rest stop. I'm simply making sure the right people know what kind of character you really have." "This is insane. You're talking about ruining my life because you're hurt about a misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding. You knew exactly what you were doing when you drove away from that rest stop. You knew I had no way to get home. You knew I would be stranded and frightened and alone. You just didn't care." I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of finally speaking the truth out loud. For the first time in years, I had refused to make excuses for Marcus's behavior, refused to minimize the impact of his choices, refused to protect him from the consequences of his actions. It felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. My phone immediately started ringing with callbacks from Marcus, but I ignored them. Whatever he wanted to say now, whatever promises or apologies or threats he wanted to make, I wasn't interested in hearing them. The time for private conversations and family negotiations had ended when he drove away from mile marker 187. Now it was time for the rest of the world to see who Marcus Carter really was, when he thought no one important was watching. Morrison. Marketing Group occupied the entire 15th floor of the Meridian Tower, one of those gleaming downtown office buildings that screamed success and ambition. I had been here before, years ago, for the company's holiday party when Marcus first started working there. Back then, I had been introduced as his proud mother, the woman who had raised such a talented young man. Now I was here to destroy him. The thought should have made me feel guilty, but as I rode the elevator up with Patricia beside me, I felt nothing but cold determination. Marcus had made his choice when he drove away from that rest stop. Everything that happened afterward was simply cause and effect. Patricia had dressed for battle in her sharpest business suit, the navy blue Armani that she wore to her most important court cases. I had chosen carefully, too, selecting the charcoal gray dress I wore to client meetings when I needed to project authority and competence. We looked like exactly what we were. Two successful women who were not to be underestimated or dismissed. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect makeup and a practiced smile, greeted us with professional warmth. "Ms. Chen and Mrs. Carter to see Mr. Morrison? He's expecting you. Can I get you coffee or water while you wait?" We declined refreshments and took seats in the elegant waiting area, surrounded by awards and framed photographs showcasing the agency's most successful campaigns. I recognized some of the work Marcus had been involved in, campaigns he had described to me with genuine enthusiasm back when we still talked about his job in detail. How long had it been since he had shared his professional successes with me? How long since he had called me excited about a new project or asked my opinion about a creative challenge? I couldn't remember the last time Marcus had treated me like someone whose insights might be valuable, whose experience might be relevant to his modern, sophisticated career. "Mrs. Carter?" A tall man with silver hair and kind eyes approached us, extending his hand. "I'm Rick Morrison. It's wonderful to finally meet you properly, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Rick's handshake was firm, his smile genuine, and I could see immediately why Marcus respected him. There was an authenticity about Rick Morrison that reminded me of my late husband David, a quality of straightforward decency that had become increasingly rare in Marcus's circle of colleagues and friends. "Thank you for making time for us on such short notice," I said, accepting his invitation to follow him to his corner office. The office was impressive but not ostentatious, decorated with family photos and children's artwork alongside the usual business memorabilia. A picture on his desk showed Rick with an elderly man in a wheelchair, both of them smiling broadly at some family gathering. His father, I guessed, remembering what Patricia had told me about Rick's commitment to caring for his aging parents. "Patricia mentioned this involved a personnel matter," Rick said once we were seated. "I have to admit, I'm curious and a little concerned. We pride ourselves on maintaining high standards here, both professionally and personally." Patricia and I exchanged glances and she nodded slightly, giving me the go-ahead to take the lead. This was my story to tell, my decision to make. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would change my relationship with Marcus forever, but I was past the point of caring about preservation over justice. "Mr. Morrison," I began, "I'm here to tell you about something that happened yesterday, involving your employee, Marcus Carter. I'm also here to tell you about it because Marcus is my son." Rick's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't interrupt, simply leaned back in his chair and waited for me to continue. "Yesterday, Marcus invited me to accompany him on a business trip to Charlotte. At least, that's what he told me. The reality was somewhat different." I opened the folder I had brought and pulled out printed copies of the police report, the photographs I had taken at the rest stop, and the timeline I had compiled. What actually happened was that Marcus used me as cover for a romantic getaway with his girlfriend, then abandoned me at a highway rest stop when my presence became inconvenient. I watched Rick's expression change as I laid out the evidence, his initial confusion giving way to shock, and then to something that looked like disgust. He studied the police report carefully, examining the incident details and the license plate information that identified Marcus as the abandoning party. "This says you were left at mile marker 187 at approximately 6:30 in the evening," Rick said slowly. "How did you get home?" "A friend arranged for a car service after I called for help. I spent nearly 3 hours stranded at that rest stop, not knowing if anyone would help me or if I would have to spend the night there." Rick set down the police report and rubbed his forehead, the gesture of a man trying to process information that conflicted with everything he thought he knew about someone. "Mrs. Carter, I have to ask, is there any possibility this was a misunderstanding? Could Marcus have thought you had other arrangements?" I have a recording of our phone conversation this morning where Marcus admits to what he did, I said, pulling out my phone. He tried to gaslight me at first, claiming I was confused about what happened. When I mentioned the police report, he changed his story. Would you like to hear it? Rick nodded grimly, and I played the recording I had made of our conversation. The office fell silent except for Marcus's voice coming through the phone speaker, first lying about the incident, then trying to minimize it, then finally attempting to negotiate his way out of consequences. When the recording ended, Rick sat in silence for a long moment, staring out the window at the city skyline. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled anger. Mrs. Carter, I owe you an apology on behalf of this company. We hired Marcus based on his qualifications and his character references, and clearly our assessment of his character was severely flawed. I'm not here seeking an apology, I said quietly. I'm here because I believe you deserve to know what kind of person you've been employing. Marcus calculated that his actions would have no professional consequences because he assumed I was powerless to affect his career. I wanted him to learn that calculation was wrong. Patricia leaned forward slightly. Rick, you should also know that criminal charges are being considered. Elder abandonment is a felony, and the district attorney's office will likely be very interested in this case, especially given the witness, testimony, and documentation. Rick's face went pale. Criminal charges? Jesus. Mrs. Carter, I am so sorry. I can't imagine what you must have gone through, and I can't begin to understand how someone could treat their own mother this way. Marcus has been pulling away from me for years, I admitted, making me feel like an embarrassment, like my presence in his life was something he had to tolerate rather than value. Yesterday was just the logical conclusion of that attitude. He decided I was disposable, so he disposed of me. Well, he's about to learn that his actions have consequences, Rick said, reaching for his phone. I'm calling him back from Charlotte immediately. This conference can damn well proceed without him. Actually, I said, holding up a hand to stop him, I'd prefer that you didn't warn him. Let him finish his conference. Let him enjoy his romantic. Get away with Vanessa? Let him think he got away with this. Then, when he comes back expecting to return to his normal life, he can discover what the real consequences look like. Rick studied my face for a moment, then slowly set down his phone. You're absolutely right. Marcus made a calculated decision to abandon you, thinking there would be no consequences. He deserves to be blindsided by the reality that he was wrong. We spent the next hour going over the details, with Rick asking careful questions about the timeline and the circumstances. He was building a case, I realized, documenting everything he would need to justify the action he was about to take. By the time we left his office, Marcus Carter's employment at Morrison Marketing Group was effectively over, even though Marcus wouldn't know it until he returned from Charlotte. There's one more thing, Rick said as we prepared to leave. Mrs. Carter, I want you to know that what happened to you is completely unacceptable, and I'm going to make sure everyone in this industry knows it. Marcus won't be able to simply move to another agency and pretend this never happened. The implication was clear. Rick Morrison had influence throughout the marketing community, and he intended to use it. Marcus wouldn't just lose his current job. He would find it very difficult to get another one in the same field. As Patricia and I rode the elevator down from the 15th floor, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that Marcus would finally face real consequences for his choices. Sadness that our relationship had deteriorated to the point where I was willing to destroy his career to teach him a lesson about basic human decency. How do you feel? Patricia asked as we walked through the building's marble lobby. Like I've just burned down a bridge I spent 34 years building, I said honestly, but also like I should have burned it down years ago before it became unsafe to cross. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and my laptop, working on something I had never thought I would need to write. A new will. Marcus had been the primary beneficiary of everything I owned, the recipient of a lifetime of careful saving and investing and planning. After yesterday, that was going to change. I had always assumed that Marcus would inherit my business, my house, my savings, everything I had worked so hard to build. I had imagined him carrying on the interior design firm I had started from nothing, maybe even appreciating the legacy I was leaving him. Now I realized that Marcus would probably sell everything as quickly as possible, convert my life's work into cash he could spend on expensive dinners and luxury vacations. The interior design business would go to my assistant Jennifer, a talented, young woman who understood the value of what we had built together and would preserve it rather than liquidate it. The house would be sold, with the proceeds going to a scholarship fund for children of military families, kids like Marcus who had lost a parent in service, but unlike Marcus had learned to value the sacrifices others made for them. My savings and investments would be divided between several charities, organizations that helped abandoned elderly people and supported single mothers trying to build better lives for their children. If Marcus wanted to benefit from my death, he would have to earn it through the kind of decent behavior he had been unwilling to show me while I was alive. It was nearly midnight when I finished the preliminary draft of the new will. Tomorrow, I would call my attorney and make it official, but tonight I wanted to sit with the decisions I had made and make sure I was at peace with them. My phone had been buzzing intermittently all evening with calls and texts from Marcus, increasingly frantic messages as he realized I wasn't going to answer. The messages had evolved throughout the day, starting with anger and moving through bargaining to what looked like genuine panic. "Mom, we need to talk about this like adults. I know you're upset, but you're being irrational. Please don't do anything you'll regret. Mom, I'm sorry, okay? I made a mistake. Can we please work this out? What do you want? I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Mom, please, I'm begging you. Don't destroy my life over one bad decision." Reading through the progression of messages, I could see Marcus slowly realizing that this wasn't going to blow over, that I wasn't going to accept his apologies and move on like I always had before. He was beginning to understand that he had finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But even his panic was self-centered, focused entirely on how this situation would affect him, rather than on the pain he had caused me. Even now, facing the destruction of his career, Marcus was thinking about his own regrets rather than mine. At 12:30, my phone rang with a call from Marcus. This time I answered. "Mom, thank God. I've been trying to reach you all day." "I know. I've been busy making arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" His voice was tight with anxiety. "Legal arrangements, financial arrangements, professional arrangements. The kind of arrangements you make when you realize your only child views you as disposable." "Mom, please. I know I screwed up yesterday. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. But we can fix this. We can work through this as a family." "We stopped being a family when you drove away from mile marker 187, I said calmly. "Now we're just two people who used to know each other." "That's not true. You're my mother. I love you." "Love is not something you claim, Marcus. It's something you demonstrate. And yesterday you demonstrated very clearly how you feel about me." "One mistake doesn't erase 34 years of—" "It wasn't one mistake," I interrupted. "It was the culmination of years of increasingly disrespectful behavior. Years of treating me like an embarrassment. Years of making me feel like my presence in your life was an inconvenience you had to tolerate. Yesterday was just the first time. You acted on what you've been feeling for a long time." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if he had hung up. Finally, his voice came through the phone, smaller than I had heard it sound since he was a child. "Mom, what can I do? Tell me what I can do to fix this." "You can start by accepting that some things can't be fixed," I said. "You can accept that choices have consequences, even when the consequences are bigger than you expected." You can learn from this experience and make sure you never treat another human being the way you treated me yesterday. But what about us? What about our relationship? I looked around my kitchen, at the photos on the refrigerator that chronicled Marcus's childhood, at the ceramic mug he had made me in third-grade pottery class that I still used every morning, at all the physical reminders of the life we had shared before he decided I was expendable. There is no us anymore, Marcus. You made that decision when you abandoned me at a highway rest stop. Now you get to live with it. I hung up before he could respond, then turned off my phone entirely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new consequences, new opportunities, for Marcus to learn what it felt like to be discarded by someone whose opinion mattered to him. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely. I was no longer carrying the weight of a relationship that had become toxic, no longer making excuses for behavior that was inexcusable, no longer protecting someone who had proven he didn't deserve protection. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather, the kind of perfect autumn day that makes you want to take long walks and appreciate simple pleasures. I dressed carefully in my favorite burgundy blazer and drove downtown to meet with my attorney, carrying the draft of my new will and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Eleanor Hartwell had been my lawyer for over a decade, handling everything from business contracts to estate planning with the kind of competence and discretion that made her worth every penny of her considerable fees. She was also sharp enough to realize immediately that something significant had happened when I called requesting an emergency appointment to revise my will. "Judy," she said, gesturing me into her office with its floor-to-ceiling law books and elegant furniture. "What's brought about this sudden need to restructure your estate plan?" I handed her the draft I had prepared, then sat back and told her the whole story, starting with Marcus's invitation and ending with our phone conversation the night before. Eleanor listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly just absorbing the details with the kind of professional calm that comes from years of dealing with family betrayals and broken relationships. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with something that might have been admiration. "Judy, I have to say, I'm impressed by how you've handled this situation. Many people in your position would have either made excuses for their child's behavior or responded with pure emotion rather than strategic thinking. You've managed to respond proportionally while still maintaining your dignity." "I don't feel very dignified," I admitted. "I feel like I've spent 34 years building a relationship with someone who turned out to be a stranger." "That's not your fault," Eleanor said firmly. "Children don't come with guarantees, and sometimes, despite our best efforts, they grow up to be people we don't recognize or respect. What matters now is how you protect yourself and your legacy going forward." We spent the next 2 hours going through every detail of the new will, making sure the language was precise and the intentions were clear. Marcus would receive a small inheritance, enough to acknowledge our biological relationship, but not enough to benefit significantly from my death. Everything else would go to people and organizations that had demonstrated the kind of values Marcus had abandoned. "There's one more thing," I said, as we prepared to finalize the documents. "I want to establish a foundation in my late husband's name, something that helps military families deal with loss and transition. David died serving his country, and I want his memory honored by helping other families who are facing what Marcus and I faced when he was 8 years old." Eleanor smiled, the first genuine warmth I had seen from her all morning. "That's beautiful, Judy. David would be proud of what you're doing, both with the foundation and with how you've handled this situation with Marcus." As I left Eleanor's office with signed copies of my new will, I felt a strange sense of completion, as if I had just finished a chapter of my life that had been dragging on too long. Marcus's inheritance was no longer something he could count on, no longer a safety net that would allow him to continue making poor choices without consequences. Now he would have to build his own life, earn his own security, and live with the results of his own decisions. It was something I probably should have forced him to do years ago. My phone had been buzzing all morning with increasingly desperate messages from Marcus, but I had learned my lesson about responding to his attempts at manipulation. Instead, I drove to the botanical gardens on the edge of town, a peaceful place where I often went to think when life became overwhelming. The Four Gardens were nearly empty on a weekday morning, just a few dedicated photographers and elderly couples taking advantage of the perfect weather. I found a bench near the rose garden and sat in the sunshine, feeling more at peace than I had in months. This was what my life could be like without the constant stress of managing Marcus's emotions and making excuses for his behavior. This was what freedom felt like when you stopped trying to force a relationship with someone who didn't value your presence. My phone rang, interrupting my meditation. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. "Anyway, Mrs. Carter? This is Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. I'm calling about a story we're working on regarding elder abandonment. We understand you were recently involved in an incident that resulted in a police report, and we'd like to give you the opportunity to share your story." My blood ran cold. "I'm sorry. How did you get my name and number?" "Police reports are public record, Mrs. Carter. We routinely review them for potential news stories, and this particular case caught our attention because of the unusual circumstances and the fact that it involved a family member rather than a stranger." I closed my eyes, feeling the careful control I had maintained over this situation beginning to slip away. A news story would make everything public, would turn Marcus's abandonment of me into a cautionary tale that would follow him for the rest of his life. "Mrs. Carter? Are you still there? Would you be willing to speak with us about what happened?" I thought about Marcus, probably still in Charlotte, still thinking he could somehow negotiate his way out of the consequences of his choices. He had no idea that his story was about to become public knowledge, that his name and face might soon be associated with one of the most callous acts of family betrayal imaginable. "Yes," I said finally. "I think I would like to tell my story. Because sometimes the only way to make sure someone learns from their mistakes is to make sure the whole world knows what those mistakes were." The news interview was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at my house, which gave me 2 days to prepare for what would likely be the most difficult conversation of my life. Jennifer Walsh had been professional and sympathetic over the phone, explaining that they wanted to focus on the broader issue of elder abandonment, while using my story as a specific example of how family betrayal could happen to anyone. "We're not looking to sensationalize this," she had assured me. "We want to tell a story that helps people understand why family loyalty matters and what happens when it breaks down. Your situation is particularly compelling because of the contrast between your son's professional success and his personal failures." I spent Wednesday morning cleaning house with an intensity that probably wasn't necessary for a television crew, but the physical activity helped calm my nerves. As I dusted and vacuumed and organized, I found myself thinking about all the times Marcus had brought friends home during high school and college, how proud I had been to show off our comfortable, welcoming home. Would he be proud of me now, sitting in that same living room, telling the world about the worst thing he had ever done to me? The thought should have given me pause, should have made me reconsider my decision to go public with our family's private pain. Instead, it strengthened my resolve. Marcus had forfeited the right to my protection when he drove away from mile marker 187. If he was embarrassed by the public exposure of his behavior, maybe he should have thought about that before engaging in behavior that was embarrassing. My phone had been quiet since Tuesday night, which surprised me. I had expected Marcus to keep trying to reach me, to escalate his attempts at negotiation or apology. The silence was somehow more unsettling than his frantic messages had been, leaving me to wonder what he was planning, or whether he had simply given up entirely. Wednesday evening brought an unexpected visitor. I was in my kitchen preparing a simple dinner when the doorbell rang, and through the front window I could see a sleek black car in my driveway. For a moment, my heart jumped with the irrational hope that Marcus had come home early from Charlotte, that he was standing on my doorstep ready to apologize properly and make amends. Instead, I opened the door to find Vanessa, looking more polished and intimidating than I had ever seen her. She wore an expensive-looking coat and carried a designer handbag, her makeup applied with professional precision despite the late hour. This wasn't the casual, dismissive girlfriend I remembered from the car ride to Charlotte. This was a woman on a mission. "Mrs. Carter," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I was hoping we could have a conversation about this misunderstanding between you and Marcus." "There's no misunderstanding," I said, not inviting her inside. "And I have nothing to discuss with you." "Please," Vanessa said, her voice taking on a pleading quality that sounded practiced rather than genuine. "Just 5 minutes. I think there are some things you don't understand about what happened on Sunday, and I'd like the chance to explain." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let her into my living room. Vanessa settled herself on my sofa with the kind of careful grace that suggested she was used to managing difficult conversations, and I realized that Marcus had probably sent her as an advance negotiator. "Mrs. Carter, I want you to know that Marcus is absolutely devastated by what happened," she began, her voice warm with synthetic concern. "He's barely slept since Sunday night, and he's been beating himself up about the miscommunication that led to you being stranded." "Miscommunication?" I repeated, settling into my chair across from her. "Is that what we're calling it now?" "I think Marcus panicked," Vanessa continued, ignoring my sarcasm. "He was stressed about the conference, and when you seemed confused about the arrangements, he made a poor decision to leave you at that rest stop instead of working through the confusion together." The lies came so smoothly, delivered with such apparent sincerity, that I almost admired Vanessa's skill. She was rewriting history in real time, creating a version of events that cast Marcus as an overwhelmed young man who had made an honest mistake rather than someone who had deliberately abandoned his mother. "Vanessa," I said calmly, "I was in that car. I heard you laugh when Rick Morrison joked about not having mommy cramp Marcus's style. I heard you suggest getting me a hotel room rather than letting me continue to Charlotte. I know exactly what happened and why it happened." Vanessa's perfect composure slipped slightly, a flash of something harder showing through her sympathetic mask. "Mrs. Carter, I think you may have misinterpreted some casual conversation. Sometimes when people are nervous, they say things that come out wrong. And sometimes when people show you who they really are, you should believe them the first time." We stared at each other across my coffee table, two women who understood exactly what this conversation was really about. Vanessa hadn't come here to apologize or explain. She had come to assess the damage and figure out how to minimize it. "Mrs. Carter, I'm going to be direct with you," Vanessa said, abandoning her sympathetic persona entirely. "Marcus has a very promising career ahead of him, and this situation could destroy everything he's worked for. I don't think that's really what you want, is it? What I want is for Marcus to learn that his actions have consequences." "But this level of consequences, Mrs. Carter, we're talking about his entire future, his reputation, his professional relationships, his ability to support a family someday. Is one bad decision really worth destroying all of that?" I studied Vanessa's face, noting the calculation behind her concern, the way she was carefully gauging my reactions to adjust her approach. This was a woman who was used to getting what she wanted through manipulation and emotional leverage, and she was trying to figure out which buttons to push to make me back down. "Tell me something." "Vanessa," I said, "what would you do if someone abandoned your mother at a highway rest stop?" "That's different," she said quickly. "My mother and I have a different kind of relationship." "Different how?" Vanessa shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting to be put on the defensive. "We respect each other's boundaries. We don't interfere in each other's lives." "Ah," I said, understanding beginning to dawn. "So, you think I was interfering in Marcus's life by accepting his invitation to accompany him to Charlotte?" "I think sometimes parents have trouble letting their adult children live independently, she said carefully. And you think that justifies abandoning me at a rest stop? I think it explains why Marcus might have felt overwhelmed and made a poor choice in the heat of the moment. I leaned back in my chair, finally understanding the depth of Vanessa's influence over Marcus's behavior. She hadn't just encouraged his disrespect toward me. She had actively cultivated it, convincing him that any attention he showed me was a sign of unhealthy dependence rather than normal family affection. Vanessa, I want you to listen to me very carefully, I said. Marcus didn't abandon me in the heat of the moment. He planned it. He lied to me about the purpose of the trip, discussed getting rid of me with his boss over the phone, and drove away without a backward glance. That wasn't poor judgment under pressure. That was calculated cruelty. But you can stop this from ruining his life, she pressed on. You can call off whatever arrangements you've made, tell people it was a misunderstanding, let him rebuild his reputation. You have that power. You're absolutely right, I agreed. I do have that power. The question is why you think I should use it to protect someone who showed me no protection when I needed it. Vanessa's mask slipped entirely then, revealing the cold ambition underneath. Because he's your son, and that's what mothers do. They protect their children, even when their children make mistakes. Marcus is 34 years old, I said quietly. He's not a child who needs protection from the consequences of his choices. He's a grown man who needs to learn that treating people badly has real costs. So you're really going to destroy him over this? You're really going to throw away 34 years of being his mother because of one incident? I'm not throwing away anything. Marcus threw away our relationship when he decided I was disposable. I'm simply making sure he understands what that decision cost him. Vanessa stood abruptly, her composure completely gone now, her face flushed, with anger and frustration. You know what? Maybe Marcus was right to want some distance from you. Maybe you are the kind of person who holds grudges and seeks revenge instead of showing forgiveness and understanding. Maybe, I agreed calmly. But at least I'm not the kind of person who abandons elderly family members at highway rest stops. After Vanessa left, slamming my front door hard enough to rattle the windows, I sat in my living room feeling strangely energized by the confrontation. She had shown me exactly what I was dealing with, not just Marcus's poor judgment, but a girlfriend, who actively encouraged his worst impulses and helped him rationalize behavior that should have been unthinkable. The fact that Marcus had sent Vanessa instead of coming himself told me everything I needed to know about his level of genuine remorse. He was still trying to manage the situation rather than face it, still looking for ways to minimize consequences, rather than accept responsibility. Thursday morning brought a flurry of activity as the news crew arrived at my house with cameras and lights and equipment that transformed my peaceful living room into a television studio. Jennifer Walsh was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence and professional competence that reminded me of Patricia. Mrs. Carter, thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview, she said as the technicians set up their equipment. I know this can't be easy for you, talking about such a personal and painful experience. It's not easy, I agreed, but I think it's important. If sharing my story helps even one family avoid this kind of breakdown, it will be worth the discomfort. We spent a few minutes going over the questions Jennifer planned to ask. Nothing too surprising or invasive, just a straightforward account of what had happened and how it had affected me. She was particularly interested in the broader implications of elder abandonment and the way family relationships could deteriorate when respect was lost. One thing I want to explore, she said as the cameraman adjusted his angles, is the idea that this could happen to anyone. You're not a vulnerable elderly person living in poverty or isolation. You're an educated, successful woman with resources and connections. If this can happen to you, it can happen to anyone. When the cameras started rolling, I found myself surprisingly calm, speaking clearly and directly about the events of Sunday evening without dramatizing or minimizing what had happened. I told the story simply, letting the facts speak for themselves, and I could see from Jennifer's expressions that the impact was exactly what she had hoped for. "Mrs. Carter," she said during the interview, "what do you want people to understand about elder abandonment?" "I want them to understand that it's not just something that happens to strangers," I said, looking directly into the camera. "It's something that can happen within families when respect breaks down and people start viewing their elderly relatives as burdens rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity." "Do you have a message for your son?" I paused, thinking about Marcus somewhere in Charlotte, probably still believing he could find a way to minimize the damage he had caused. "My message is that actions have consequences, even when you think no one important enough to matter is watching, especially then." The interview lasted about an hour, and when it was over, Jennifer assured me that the story would air during the evening news on Friday, giving Marcus just enough time to return from Charlotte and discover what was waiting for him. "Mrs. Carter," she said as the crew packed up their equipment, "I have to tell you, I'm impressed by your composure throughout this whole situation. A lot of people would have handled this very differently. A lot of people probably would have handled it better," I said, "but this felt like the right choice for me." That afternoon, I received a call from Rick Morrison. "Mrs. Carter, I wanted to give you an update on the situation with Marcus. He's scheduled to return tomorrow afternoon, and I've arranged for him to come directly to my office from the airport. I thought you should know that we've also received some additional information that makes his termination even more appropriate." "So, what kind of additional information?" "It turns out that Marcus has been misrepresenting some of his client relationships, taking credit for accounts that other team members developed, and overstating his role in several successful campaigns. We probably would have discovered this eventually during his annual review, but your situation prompted us to take a closer look at his overall performance and integrity." I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Marcus hadn't just betrayed me. He had been betraying his colleagues and employer as well. The abandonment at the rest stop wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was part of a pattern of dishonesty and self-serving behavior that had been building for who knows how long. Will this affect his ability to find other employment? In this industry? Absolutely. Word travels fast, and integrity issues are taken very seriously. Marcus is going to find it very difficult to rebuild his career, especially once word gets out about what he did to you. That evening, I had dinner with Patricia at a quiet restaurant downtown, our first chance to catch up since everything had begun unraveling. She looked tired but satisfied, the expression of someone who had seen justice served after a long fight. "How are you holding up?" she asked over wine and pasta. "Better than I expected," I said honestly. I thought I would feel guilty about destroying Marcus's career, but mostly I just feel relieved, like I finally stopped carrying a weight I didn't realize was crushing me. "You didn't destroy his career," Patricia reminded me. "He destroyed it himself when he made the choice to abandon his mother at a highway rest stop. You just made sure the right people knew what kind of person they were dealing with. Do you think I'm being too harsh? Vanessa seems to think I should forgive and forget, let him rebuild his reputation and move on." Patricia set down her wine glass and looked at me with the kind of serious expression she usually reserved for closing arguments. "Judy, let me tell you something about forgiveness. Real forgiveness requires real repentance, which means acknowledging the full scope of what you did wrong and taking meaningful steps to make amends. Marcus hasn't done any of that. He's still trying to minimize what happened and avoid consequences. So what happens now? Now Marcus comes home tomorrow and discovers that his choices have completely altered the trajectory of his life. He'll be unemployed, unemployable in his chosen field, and facing potential criminal charges. Most importantly, he'll have lost the relationship with the one person who loved him unconditionally for 34 years. I thought about Marcus as a little boy, The child who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, who trusted me to fix everything that went wrong in his small world. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw me as an obstacle to his happiness rather than a source of love and support. "Do you think there's any chance he'll actually learn from this?" I asked. "I think there's a chance," Patricia said carefully. "But it will take time, and it will require him to do some very difficult self-examination. The question is whether you'll be willing to rebuild a relationship with him if he does that work." I didn't have an answer to that question. Not yet. All I knew was that the old relationship, the one where I made excuses for his behavior and absorbed his disrespect, was over. If Marcus wanted a place in my life again, he would have to earn it by becoming someone worthy of respect and trust. And based on everything that had happened, that transformation would take a very long time. Friday morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that matched my mood as I prepared for what would likely be the most difficult day in this entire ordeal. Marcus would be returning from Charlotte this afternoon, expecting to slide back into his normal routine, unaware that his normal life no longer existed. I spent the morning at my office, trying to focus on client consultations and design projects, but my mind kept drifting to what Marcus was going to face over the next few hours. By now, he had probably seen missed calls from Rick Morrison, though he likely assumed they were routine business matters that could wait until he returned to the office. At 2 o'clock, Jennifer Walsh called to let me know that the news story would air at 6:11 that evening, giving me one last chance to change my mind about going public. "I'm ready," I told her, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. At 3:30, my phone rang with a call from Marcus. I let it go to voicemail, not ready to deal with whatever panic or anger he was experiencing as his world began to collapse. The voicemail, when I finally listened to it, was brief and confused. "Mom, I just got back from Charlotte and there are some weird messages on my phone from work. Can you call me back? I think there might be some kind of misunderstanding that needs to be cleared up." The innocence in his voice, the assumption that this was all just a misunderstanding that could be easily resolved, showed me how completely Marcus had failed to grasp the magnitude of what he had done. Even now, facing the destruction of everything he had worked for, he still thought this was something that could be smoothed over with the right explanation. At 4:15, my phone rang again. This time, it was Rick Morrison. "Mrs. Carter, I thought you'd want to know that I just finished meeting with Marcus. He's been terminated, effective immediately, and he's been escorted from the building. I've also spoken with several other agency heads in the area to make sure they're aware of the situation." How did he take it? About as well as you'd expect. A lot of anger, a lot of denial, some attempts to blame you for destroying his life. He still doesn't seem to understand that he did this to himself. After Rick hung up, I sat in my office, staring out the window at the gray afternoon, imagining Marcus driving home from what had been his dream job just a few hours earlier. By now, he probably understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a temporary setback. By now, he probably realized that his life had fundamentally changed and there was no going back to the way things were. At 6 o'clock, I turned on the television in my office and watched myself tell the world about my son's betrayal. The story was powerful and devastating, exactly what Jennifer had promised it would be. My calm recounting of the facts, combined with the police report and the obvious emotional impact of the abandonment, created a narrative that was impossible to dismiss or minimize. The story included Marcus's full name, his former employer, and enough details about the circumstances to make it clear that this wasn't a case of misunderstanding or miscommunication. This was a deliberate act of cruelty committed by a successful professional against his own mother. As the story ended, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Marcus would never be able to escape this narrative now. For the rest of his life, when people Googled his name, this would be the first thing they found. His professional reputation, his social standing, His entire identity as a successful young businessman, all of it had been permanently altered by 10 minutes of television coverage. My phone started ringing immediately after the broadcast ended. Calls from friends and acquaintances who had seen the story and wanted to offer support or express their shock. I let most of them go to voicemail, not ready to process other people's reactions when I was still processing my own. At 7:30, Marcus called again. This time, I answered. "Mom," he said, and his voice was hollow, defeated in a way I had never heard before. "I just saw the news." "I imagine you did. How could you do this to me? How could you destroy my entire life on television?" The question hung between us, and I realized that even now, even after losing his job and facing public humiliation, Marcus still didn't understand what he had done wrong. He was still focused on what had been done to him rather than what he had done to me. "Marcus," I said quietly, "I didn't destroy your life. You destroyed it when you abandoned me at mile marker 187. Everything that's happened since then has just been the natural consequence of that choice. But the news story, the interview, you didn't have to make it public. We could have worked this out privately. We could have worked it out privately if you had come to me privately with genuine remorse and a plan to make amends. Instead, you sent your girlfriend to negotiate with me like I was a business problem that needed to be managed." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if he had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I could barely hear him. "Mom, I know I screwed up. I know I hurt you. But did it really have to cost me everything?" "That's not a question you should be asking me," I said. "That's a question you should have asked yourself before you drove away from that rest stop." I hung up before he could respond, then turned off my phone entirely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new consequences, new opportunities for Marcus to learn what it meant to lose everything because of your own choices. But tonight, I was done being his mother. Tonight, I was just a woman who had finally stopped making excuses for someone who didn't deserve them. The weeks following the news broadcast settled into a strange new rhythm. My phone stopped ringing with Marcus's desperate attempts at reconciliation, replaced instead by calls from reporters wanting follow-up interviews, and strangers who had seen the story and wanted to share their own experiences with family betrayal. The story had struck a nerve, apparently, resonating with people who had their own children who had forgotten the value of loyalty and respect. I declined most of the interview requests, having said everything I needed to say during that first broadcast. The story had taken on a life of its own, shared thousands of times on social media, with comments ranging from outrage at Marcus's behavior to admiration for my refusal to enable it. Some people criticized me for going public with family business, but their voices were drowned out by the chorus of support from people who understood exactly what I had endured. Detective Rodriguez called to update me on the criminal case. The district attorney had decided to pursue elder abandonment charges, partly because of the clear evidence, and partly because the case had generated enough public attention to make it politically advantageous. Marcus would be facing a grand jury within the month, and Rodriguez seemed confident that an indictment was likely. "Cases like this don't usually get this much attention," he told me over the phone. But the fact that it involved someone with professional standing, someone who should have known better, makes it more significant. The DA wants to send a message that this kind of behavior has serious consequences regardless of your socioeconomic status. I found myself oddly detached from the legal proceedings, as if they were happening to someone else's family rather than my own. The criminal case felt like a separate issue from the personal betrayal, a matter for the justice system to handle while I focused on rebuilding my life without Marcus in it. Patricia had been right about one thing. Losing the weight of that relationship had been liberating in ways I hadn't expected. For years, I had unconsciously shaped my decisions around Marcus's potential reactions, avoiding activities or friendships or choices that might disappoint or embarrass him. Now, suddenly, I was free to live entirely for myself. I started taking pottery classes at the community center, something I had always wanted to try but had never made time for. The feel of clay between my fingers, the meditative focus required to shape something beautiful from raw material, provided a kind of peace I hadn't known I was missing. The other students were mostly women my age or older, many of them dealing with their own family disappointments and transitions. It's amazing how much energy we waste trying to maintain relationships with people who don't value them, said Helen, a 70-year-old retired teacher whose daughter had moved across the country and rarely called. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is stop trying so hard. I also began traveling, something David and I had always planned to do but never managed before his deployment ended everything. First, a long weekend in Savannah, staying in a charming bed and breakfast and exploring historic homes and gardens. Then a week in Santa Fe, taking a workshop on Southwestern design techniques that added new dimensions to my professional skills. Each trip was a small declaration of independence, a reminder that my life had value and purpose beyond my role as Marcus's mother. I was rediscovering the woman I had been before motherhood consumed my identity, the woman who had interests and dreams that didn't revolve around anyone else's approval or needs. The interior design business was thriving, partly because of the publicity from the news story, but mostly because I was approaching it with renewed energy and focus. Clients seemed to sense the change in me, the increased confidence and clarity that came from knowing exactly who I was and what I wanted. Projects that might have overwhelmed me before felt manageable, exciting even. Jennifer Walsh called one afternoon to tell me that the story had won a regional journalism award for human interest reporting. The judges said it was a perfect example of how personal stories can illuminate broader social issues, she said. I wanted you to know because none of it would have been possible without your courage in coming forward. I'm glad something positive came out of it, I said, though I still wasn't sure courage was the right word for what I had done. It had felt more like necessity, like finally choosing to stop pretending that an unacceptable situation was acceptable. Have you heard anything from your son since the story aired? No, and I don't expect to. Marcus is probably focused on trying to rebuild his life, and I hope he succeeds at that. But our relationship, at least the way it was, is over. I meant it when I said I hoped Marcus succeeded at rebuilding his life, though I had no illusions about how difficult that would be. The news story had followed him everywhere, making it virtually impossible to find work in marketing or any field that required a background check. I had heard through mutual acquaintances that he and Vanessa had broken up, though whether that was because of the scandal or other issues, I didn't know. Part of me felt guilty about the scope of the consequences Marcus was facing, but a larger part of me recognized that this was what accountability looked like. For too many years, I had shielded him from the natural results of his choices, teaching him that he could treat people badly without losing anything he valued. Now he was learning a different lesson, one that might ultimately serve him better if he was willing to absorb it. 6 months after the news story aired, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. The return address was unfamiliar, but something about the handwriting looked familiar. When I opened it, I found a single sheet of paper covered in Marcus's careful script. Mom, it began. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. I've spent the last 6 months thinking about what happened, about the choices I made, and the person I became, and I finally understand some things I should have understood a long time ago. You were right when you said I destroyed our relationship. You were right when you said actions have consequences. You were right when you said I had forgotten what love looks like when it's real instead of convenient. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness, because I know I haven't earned it. I'm not writing to ask you to fix what I broke, because I know that's not your responsibility. I'm writing to tell you that I finally understand what I lost when I drove away from that rest stop, and it wasn't just a ride home. I lost the one person who loved me unconditionally for 34 years. I lost the woman who sacrificed everything to give me opportunities I never appreciated. I lost my mother, and I lost her because I chose convenience over compassion, image over integrity, selfishness over family. I'm working construction now, the only job I could find that doesn't require a background check or references from my previous career. It's hard work, but it's honest work. And for the first time in years, I'm not pretending to be someone I'm not. My colleagues don't know about my education or my former salary or my professional accomplishments. They judge me based on how hard I work and how I treat the people around me. I'm also seeing a counselor, someone who specializes in family relationships and helping people understand how they develop patterns of selfishness and entitlement. It's not easy work, examining the ways you've hurt people and the beliefs that made those choices seem acceptable. But I'm learning things about myself that I should have learned a long time ago. I know I can't undo what I did. I know I can't take back the pain I caused you or the humiliation of being abandoned by your own son. I know our relationship may never recover from what I destroyed. But I want you to know that you were right to stop protecting me from consequences. You were right to stop making excuses for behavior that was inexcusable. You were right to choose yourself over someone who had stopped choosing you. I hope you're happy, Mom. I hope you're living the life you deserve, surrounded by people who value what you bring to the world. You deserve so much better than the son I became. And I'm sorry. It took losing you completely for me to understand that. Love, Marcus. I read the letter 3 times before setting it down on my kitchen table, the same table where Marcus used to do his homework while I cooked dinner, where we used to plan his science fair projects and discuss his dreams for the future. The words felt genuine in a way his previous apologies hadn't, less focused on managing the situation and more focused on acknowledging the reality of what he had done. But genuine regret, I had learned, wasn't the same thing as a repaired relationship. Marcus could understand his mistakes without being entitled to forgiveness. He could change his behavior without automatically regaining what he had lost through his previous choices. I folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer where I kept important documents, not because I was ready to rebuild our relationship, but because it represented something I had wondered if Marcus would ever achieve. Genuine accountability. That evening, I called Patricia to tell her about the letter. "How do you feel about it?" she asked after I read it to her over the phone. Relieved, I think. Not because I want to reconcile with him, but because it suggests he might actually learn something from this experience. For the longest time, I worried that he would just blame me for ruining his life instead of examining his own choices. "Do you think you'll respond to the letter?" I considered the question, turning it over in my mind like a piece of pottery I was trying to shape. Maybe someday. Not now, though. If Marcus has really changed, if he's really learned to value other people instead of just managing them, then that change needs to come from his own motivation, not from the hope of getting something back from me. "That's very wise," Patricia said, and very strong. A year after the highway rest stop incident, I was featured in a magazine article about women who had rebuilt their lives after major family betrayals. The writer was particularly interested in how I had transformed a personal trauma into professional and personal growth, using the clarity that came from setting boundaries to create a more authentic and fulfilling life. "Many people in your situation would have chosen differently," the interviewer said. "They would have prioritized family harmony over accountability. What made you choose the path you chose?" I realized that family harmony built on enabling bad behavior isn't really harmony at all, I said. "It's just a prettier way to describe dysfunction. Real family relationships require mutual respect, and when that respect is gone, sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop pretending it exists." The article included updates on Marcus's situation, noting that he had completed a year of counseling and was working steadily in construction while taking night classes in social work. The writer had apparently reached out to him for comment, and he had declined to be interviewed, but had issued a brief statement acknowledging his mistakes and expressing hope that other families could learn from his example. Reading about Marcus's life from the objective distance of a magazine article felt strange, like hearing about the activities of someone I had once known well, but no longer had any personal connection to. I was glad he seemed to be building something positive from the wreckage of his previous life, but his progress didn't create any obligation for me to invite him back into mine. The criminal case had been resolved months earlier, with Marcus pleading guilty to elder endangerment and receiving a suspended sentence along with community service and mandatory counseling. The plea agreement meant he wouldn't serve jail time, but the conviction would remain on his permanent record, a lasting reminder of the choice he had made at mile marker 187. On the second anniversary of the abandonment, I drove back to that rest stop for the first time since the incident. I wasn't sure what I expected to find there, or why I felt compelled to return, but something about the date felt significant enough to mark with a pilgrimage of sorts. The rest stop looked exactly the same as it had that evening 2 years earlier, busy with travelers and truckers and families breaking up long drives. I parked in approximately the same spot where Marcus had left me, and sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to reconnect with the woman who had stood here 2 years ago, confused and abandoned and heartbroken. That woman felt like someone I had known well but had grown beyond, someone whose pain I remembered but no longer carried. The abandonment had been traumatic, but it had also been liberating, forcing me to discover strengths I hadn't known I possessed and priorities I hadn't realized I needed to set. I got out of my car and walked to the exact spot where I had stood that evening, reading Marcus's cruel text message and wondering how I would get home. Now I knew the answer. I had gotten home by learning to depend on myself instead of waiting for someone else to rescue me. A family walked past me toward the building, parents shepherding 2 young children and bickering mildly about snack choices and bathroom breaks. The ordinary domestic chaos reminded me of trips Marcus and I had taken when he was young, the kind of exhausting but loving family moments that had felt so precious at the time. I didn't miss those moments exactly, but I mourned them in a way that felt clean and complete. The way you mourn something that was genuinely good while acknowledging that it belonged to a different time and couldn't be recovered or recreated. My phone buzzed with a text message from a client wanting to schedule a consultation about redesigning her home office. I responded quickly, then got back in my car and headed home to the life I had built for myself, the life that belonged entirely to me. 3 months later, I received another letter from Marcus. This one was shorter, less focused on apology and more focused on information. Mom, I wanted you to know that I've been accepted into a master's program in social work, with a specialization in family counseling. My advisor thinks my personal experience with family breakdown, combined with the work I've done to understand it, could help me help other families avoid the mistakes I made. I'm not telling you this because I want anything from you. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that the lessons you taught me, even though I was too stubborn and selfish to learn them at the time, are going to help other people build healthier relationships with their families. I know I can't undo the damage I caused, but maybe I can prevent other families from experiencing what we experienced. Maybe something good can come from the worst thing I ever did. I hope you're well. I think about you often and wish things could have been different. Not different in the sense that you should have accepted my behavior, but different in the sense that I should have been worthy of the love you gave me for so many years. Marcus. This letter felt different from the first one, less focused on his own pain and more focused on using his experience constructively. I was genuinely glad to hear that Marcus was channeling his understanding of family dysfunction into something that might help other people, though his career choice didn't create any obligation for me to resume our relationship. I filed this letter with the first one, acknowledging his progress without feeling compelled to respond or engage. Marcus was building a new life, and I was genuinely happy for him, but his growth didn't erase the history between us or automatically restore what his choices had destroyed. That evening, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine and a book about garden design, surrounded by the flowers I had planted and the peace I had cultivated. The life I had built in the aftermath of Marcus's betrayal was fuller and more authentic than anything I had experienced during the years when I shaped myself around his needs and moods. I had friends who valued my company, work that challenged and fulfilled me, travels that broadened my horizons, and hobbies that brought me joy. I had learned to be complete within myself instead of waiting for someone else to complete me. The woman who had been abandoned at mile marker 187 2.5 years earlier had thought her life was ending. Instead, it had been beginning, though she couldn't have known it at the time. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals turned out to be the most necessary catalysts, forcing growth that would never have happened under more comfortable circumstances. As the sun set over my garden, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. Not gratitude for the pain exactly, but gratitude for the strength I had discovered in response to it. The life I had built from the ashes of the life that had been destroyed. Marcus had given me something valuable when he drove away from that rest stop, though it wasn't what he had intended to give. He had given me the gift of necessity, the push I needed to stop living for someone else's approval and start living for my own fulfillment. I raised my wine glass in a small, private toast to the woman I had become, the woman who no longer needed anyone's permission to matter. Then I opened my book and settled in to enjoy another peaceful evening in the life I had created entirely, for myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.